So this is when the politics of a country, of Europe, of different parts of the world intertwine with the politics of sport.
Hello and welcome back on Debatable on 11 Football with me, Fabrizio Romano. And every week, as always, we are discussing about football, transfers and many other topics. And today I have the big pleasure to be back and joined by top football lawyer Daniel Geey. Daniel, how are you?
Oh, good. Thanks for having me back on, and it feels like there's plenty to talk about today.
Yes, there is a lot of stuff to discuss together, Daniel, and we are super happy to have you here with us because this Chelsea story with the sanctions from the UK government to Roman Abramovich is really huge. Chelsea fans are worried. Thomas Tuchel is putting his face, he's always answering the questions, but we know that of course he's the manager, he's not part of the board. So now it's important to explore this Chelsea situation. What's next? What's going to change in the coming few weeks? So Daniel, you're the perfect person to discuss about it today with this Chelsea episode. And I wanted to start asking you, how dangerous is this situation for Chelsea Football Club?
I'm not sure if dangerous is too strong a word or too weak a word is the truth, because like a lot of things that have happened since the beginning of COVID and even before, we keep on using this word unprecedented very often. It is unprecedented that games are played or are postponed. It is unprecedented that then fans are not allowed in the stadium. It is unprecedented that the season lasts longer than it does. But this feels like another unprecedented moment. Obviously, we are talking in a very narrow sense for the absolutely horrendous things that are going on in Ukraine right now. But when we are specifically talking about Chelsea, this does feel unprecedented. We have a situation now, which was announced obviously only very recently, where the UK government has more or less said that Roman Abramovich's assets are effectively frozen. And what has happened as a result of that is that actually the UK government has given Chelsea more or less a degree of an exemption, a license, to be able to then continue trading, but in very specific circumstances. So I know we'll go on to this in lots of detail in due course, but all of these restrictions have very, very big significance. Player contracts, transfers in, transfers out, ticketing, merchandising, sponsorship agreements, the future of players, the future of the manager, and most importantly, I guess also the future of the club. Does this lead to significant financial problems now that the revenues will be much more less significant for at least a period of time? And also, as importantly for the club, does this mean now that the club cannot be sold? There has to be a question about whether the process can continue. They go to a preferred buyer, they do go through the whole transaction and then have to get clearance from the UK government to then be able to sell the club and where those proceeds of monies go to. Because then at least the club will be sold and not linked to Abramovich, who would effectively have the asset, or at least the asset frozen, and the club could then continue as a going concern without these restrictions.
Yes, and this point about selling the club is really the key one to understand what's next for Chelsea. What I wanted to ask you as a top football lawyer is, behind the scenes, what will have been the order of events to try and to sort it out? Because now Chelsea fans are obviously worried about the situation. So what's going on in your opinion, for your experience?
Well, fortunately or unfortunately, my experience doesn't count for too much in this situation because I've never been involved in such a situation in truth. But what I can at least imagine is a large playing squad and a manager, for example, to not be able to travel for a Champions League game on a private jet, for example, or might not be able to be in front of all of their home fans for a game, or might be thinking about, as you said, and we can talk about in due course in the next few minutes, potentially players wanting to renew contracts who are out of contract in the summer, potentially players that want to possibly leave the club in the summer for lots of different reasons that will be a problem. Does the squad think that they are going to continue to try and go for trophies if they have a weakened team, if they are unable to buy the best players in the world anymore? Does Thomas Tuchel, the manager, then think that this is going to be a problem for the future? I would have thought a lot of the administration and the executives in the club now will be thinking, how quickly could a potential buyer be identified and then an actual process occur for the club potentially, we don't know what the government would even say about this in truth, to be able to sell the club.
This is going to be the most important part for the process for Chelsea. But you mentioned players, and we know how important it's going to be for Chelsea Football Club to manage the situation with players, with agents. I was speaking with some agents in the last 24, 48 hours, and they were really shocked by the news, but also worried about what's next for players that are maybe out of contract in not just in June, but even in 2022 with 23, to know what's next for their clients. What I wanted to ask you is about the clauses. We know how many clauses we have in football, in contracts, and in this kind of crazy situations, the approach is completely different. It's something new, as we mentioned. You think what kind of clauses will the player have in their contracts if they want to leave the club, maybe before the end of this story?
Well, again, if we go back 12 months, 18 months, I remember lots of conversations that I had with clients around, what happens if the season finishes late or early? What happens if I don't finish this season? Are you still going to pay me? So, we look to examples of things that we wouldn't have imagined would have happened and then expect there to be an easy solution in the contract. And what I mean by that is that there is definitely no easy solution in the contract for these type of things. If we take the basic principles of the Premier League contract, which is effectively informally a bargained collective bargaining agreement between all of the stakeholders, and then there is obviously each back end of the contract is different with the release clauses, with the amounts of being paid, the image rights, and loyalty bonuses, and everything else. I cannot see a situation where a player, simply because of sanctions imposed, would have an express clause saying that they could then leave for a free transfer or for anything like this. I think, though, what might be in contracts are different types of release clauses for certain amounts of money in certain instances. That is a possibility. But I do not think simply because of the sanctions being imposed on the club that would necessarily mean that a player could leave their contract. Now, the question would be, what would happen if the club are in such financial difficulty come the summer that the only way that they can raise cash in order to pay for normal course of business matters is to be able to sell one or two players? They may have to do that because the government license would seem to suggest that they cannot receive monies to as new revenues coming into the club in the same way as that it cannot enter into new merchandising deals, as the way they can't be entering into new even agreements to buy tickets for games, for example. So it is a very, very difficult situation right now.
It's really incredible, yes. If we think that Chelsea, it's important to remind that Chelsea are champions of Europe, champions of the world, so they did an incredible season last year. And so to see what happened right now is really incredible, and it's curious to see what's next, even on some players, kind of player situation. We wanted to discuss, Daniel, player by player. For example, player out of contract in June. Tony Rudiger, from what I'm told, the expectation around him is to leave Chelsea. The conversation already a few months ago, when the situation was pretty normal, Rudiger was already discussing with some clubs from other countries and from Premier League too for a possible move in the summer. Christensen is going to join Barcelona. He's almost done deal as free agent in the summer. Azpilicueta has a proposal from Barcelona. So the players are already preparing their future. But with your experience, for players, it's now obvious to discuss with other clubs rather than say, okay, I'm going to wait for Chelsea. And also about the situation of players out of contract in June 2023. N'Golo Kante, Jorginho. I'm told that Jorginho is waiting for Chelsea since a long time to have an answer on the contract situation, and now everything is in standby again. So what's your approach as a top football lawyer on this kind of stories too?
If the club are not able to sell players and receive money for those players in contract, they have no incentive to sell the players. So that has to be one element to the story. I think the second element has to be for players that they were looking to contract who are out of contract in the summer. It would seem extremely difficult for a sale of the club to happen in time before the end of the season and for those new contracts to be in place. I think that's probably a realistic example. I think the other point also, which I don't think too many people have raised, but Chelsea have obviously one of the most impressive youth academies in world football. I was looking at some fantastic, which I know you look at as well on Twitter, Swiss Ramble, who comes out with some fantastic figures. Kieran explained that over Abramovich's era, they have sold over £600 million worth of youth players, which have obviously hugely contributed to Chelsea revenue. If players, their youth team players and first team pros, are not able to sign new contracts, there might well be a number of very important youth Chelsea players that will be leaving in the summer because they cannot sign new contracts.
It's true.
Which will obviously hurt Chelsea considerably. That's obviously another thing to consider. For players that maybe have, 16 months or so left on their contracts, they are entering a very difficult phase because Chelsea, without, I believe, the consent of the UK government, will not be able to receive any monies from incoming transfers. So I would have thought, as I said before, the incentive is to keep those existing players until either the license, which is up for renewal, I believe, in the summertime, either changes and it gives the UK government more leeway, gives the club more leeway, or a sale has happened by that time.
Yes, and the point you mentioned on young players is really important. And we know how many they had in the past, but also now they have players like Conor Gallagher, who is doing great with Crystal Palace. Armando Broja was doing fantastic with Southampton. And these players and their agents are waiting to see what Chelsea want to do. So it's a really incredible situation also to manage with young talents they have and with new signings, because we mentioned new signings as a key point of this story, because Chelsea, as you mentioned, Daniel, they are not allowed to sign any new player in this moment. And for example, I was having a conversation yesterday with people close to Jules Koundé, the centre-back of Sevilla. He was really close to join Chelsea last summer. He is still a Chelsea target. He was a Chelsea target for this summer because they still want him, but they don't know how to act now. They are just waiting for Chelsea to have a position. They know that it's going to be long, but Koundé was one of the players they were discussing, and now everything is in standby. Same is happening maybe with Declan Rice, a player that Chelsea always wanted, alongside with Man City, Man United, but now they are not able to proceed. Rafinha from Leeds, fantastic player. They like him, but they can't proceed now. So how do you see the process for new signings? Because we know that top clubs prepared the market in February, in March, in April, and they're going to have a huge problem now.
Yes, I mean, I think the short answer is, at the moment, based on the current conditions, it is impossible. Mm-hmm. And I think the two variables at the moment are amendments to the government licence, which I'm not a sanctions lawyer, I'm a football lawyer, but I understand that there is the possibility to go to government and ask either for additional exemptions or additional approval. And then the government might look at that at expiry of the current licence or otherwise. Now, we are in beginning of June. If we're talking about a club takeover for one of the largest clubs in world football, that Mr. Abramovich values at 3 billion, that he has 1.5 billion worth of loans outstanding, that KPMG value at 2.5 million and others value at different levels, for example. It is not a straightforward process to have a sale done. And because we are talking about such significant amounts of money, it's not easy suddenly to raise 1.5, 2 billion, 2.5 billion pounds for one of the biggest clubs in the world. As fast as accountants, lawyers, administrators will go, it would, at least to my mind, seem difficult that a sale could be finished in time for at least the beginning, if not the middle, if not the end of the summer transfer window.
Okay, so this is your expectation about the timing, the schedule for this potential sale of the club. I know you're not involved, of course, but this is your feeling, because it's a really important point for Chelsea fans. They're asking how long it will take. So this is your expectation. It's not going to be super fast.
I think it's very difficult to be that way unless we're effectively now talking about a distressed asset. Mm-hmm. We're not talking about a club anywhere near administration, so the administrators are not involved in the sale. But what we are talking about is a club that needs to be sold. Again, presuming that the government allows a sale to happen. And that's not a straightforward situation in itself. But it would seem that that is effectively the only way out of all of these possibilities for the club. Now, March, April, May, June, July, 4 or 5 months is, I think, very, very, very fast to be concluding a deal. And especially with complex arrangements that Chelsea have. They have a huge stadium. There was lots of planning issues involved in the redevelopment of the stadium. They have a huge array of commercial contracts, and some very large ones at that. A wage bill of over £300 million per season, which is obviously a huge amount. That Chelsea made a loss of over £150 million last year in the 2021 season. They will see that the club, after player trading, lost almost 1.4 billion pounds over the last period of time from Abramovich's regime. So even though they are spending 1.5, 2 billion pounds, at the moment, Chelsea is still quite a significant loss-making operation. So there will need to be even more funds put into the club to enable the club to continue as a going concern, even after the transaction occurs.
Mm-hmm. With your football experience, also to share something positive for Chelsea fans, is about young players. We mentioned about them, but for example, from last transfer ban for Chelsea, they had Mason Mount, that is one of the best midfielders now in Europe, and it was also thanks to the space he received from the transfer ban. You think it could be the same, for example, for Conor Gallagher or some other player in Chelsea team, in Chelsea radar for the future, or you think it could be an opportunity for them to shine with Chelsea?
It's certainly the case, with Reece James, with Gilmour and others. And that was almost
Yes.
one of the very big success stories under the Lampard regime. He came in under the transfer ban in order to promote youngsters and very talented youngsters into the squad, Chalobah included as well. So we see situations, I think, where they will almost certainly, it seems, lose those players out of contract come the summer. But that doesn't mean that the squad is not still a significant squad that isn't capable of winning lots of trophies and competing. I think in the short term, the really difficult question for Chelsea is whether they have enough cash to be able to last them until a new takeover potentially happens. I think it is short-term cash flow which becomes the issue.
Another very important point that you know very well with your experience, Daniel, is about the managers, no? And in this case, Thomas Tuchel. I think he's doing an incredible work, not just on the pitch, winning the Champions League, winning the World Cup, but what he's doing to help the club, to put his face, to show his face and answer the questions every single day is something that is not easy. So he's helping Chelsea Football Club in the day-by-day work, and really players are appreciating his effort. But now many clubs are putting their eyes on the situation of Thomas Tuchel. So how do you see this side of the story for Tuchel, maybe to be approached from another club? How is the difference on the compensation between players and managers, and if in some cases even the managers have the clauses, no buyout clauses in their contracts?
It's a fantastic question that we can take in, I think, in a few directions. But I think, principally now, whereas in years gone by, we would always see players with high and higher transfer fees. In order to agree a termination of a contract, this is the agreement between the parties in order to be able to then transfer player A to club B. What I've seen over the last few years as a growing trend is for managers to also insert release clauses. And the release clauses can be for a set amount, but obviously it can be varied depending on which year of the contract a new club approaches. It may also be dependent on a particular window, for example. And it may also be dependent on the manager's backroom staff as well, because as you know more than I, he or she comes with everything, an assistant, a head of physiotherapy, the doctors. Sometimes the managers are coming with between 8 or 10 of their staff and their entourage. The question would be, firstly, I don't know whether Tuchel has a release clause. The second question would be whether other clubs now would be very interested in him. And it may also be the question about whether actually Chelsea, if matters don't resolve themselves in quick order, and there is large compensation on the table, subject to them being able to use that compensation, which at the moment they cannot, Tuchel, I'm sure, will be on a significant salary. So again, if I said for that Chelsea's main dangerous position, I think, is short-term cash flow. If they then are able to remove large cash flow out from their accounts, then that might give them more breathing space before a new owner comes in.
This is a key point. I really agree with you, and this is going to be really important to see what happens with Thomas Tuchel in the next few months. Talking about the process, Daniel, with your experience, the process to sell the club, what sort of process would they go through to prevent another situation like this when you have a top club like Chelsea?
Not straightforward is the answer. The first thing, which is probably the most important element to a degree, is the valuation of the club. Now, we saw last week the reports were that Mr. Abramovich wanted over £3 billion for the club. That included £1.5 billion worth of loans to the holding company Fortune. And as we talked about just before, there are different valuation models to decide how much a club is worth. Is it worth as much as the stadium land is worth? Is it a combination of how much the squad value might be? Is it also the value of how much the commercial rights that the club is entitled to is worth? So, for example, Chelsea earned £146 million, I believe, from Central Premier League broadcasting rights last year. It earned €121 million from winning the Champions League last year. There would obviously have been extra bonuses from Nike, from Yokohama, from 3 this season. So what usually happens is they take all of that into account to establish what the assets and then the liabilities of a club might be. So that when they understand then the valuation of the club, they are valuing the club according to what also might be the liabilities of the club that they then are aware of. And because we are talking about such significant amounts, that process is not, as I said, a quick process. You have to get a valuation. Then usually what you do is get a heads of agreement, have a due diligence process, and you have an SPA, which is a sale and purchase agreement. You also then need to get sign off, I think, as we talked about just now, from the Premier League. So the list is endless. And I definitely don't want to bore you with all of the different processes. But what I mean is just to give you an illustration of how complicated.
It's not as easy as it seems. Yes. In particular with football clubs, I can imagine. So, no, really, thank you for sharing how it works, because Chelsea fans are now obviously waiting to see what's next. So your expectation from what you said is that these sanctions from the government are going to affect the amount that potential buyers will have to pay to buy Chelsea Football Club. So your expectation is maybe what we expected, what Abramovich communicated as a price to pay to buy Chelsea Football Club, now could be different after the sanctions?
I think that's right. I think it is a buyer's market for Chelsea. Not that it's a cheap buyer's market for Chelsea. It's still an expensive buyer's market for Chelsea. And again, we're presupposing the government allows the sale. At the moment, it's not even clear if there is a preferred purchaser, for example. Now, there is reports of different types of consortiums of buyers, because it's difficult, as we said, to find 1 billion, 2 billion, 3 billion. It's we're talking huge amounts of capital. So I would think that is the process now that I would think the club is trying to expedite, to quicken as long as possible, in order to be able to at least begin that process, because in my experience, I would be surprised if that is concluded anywhere time before the summer.
Okay. It makes sense. And I wanted to touch even on sponsors, because sponsors are a key part of the story for Chelsea. 3 decided to suspend their shirt sponsorship with Chelsea. How easy it will be for them to do this kind of thing, to decide this kind of thing in your experience? And another question I had about sponsors is, can sponsors delay payments in this kind of situation from your experience?
It's a great question. And the short answer, without becoming too legalistic in my answer, is to say it is possible. Usually in different sponsorship agreements, there are things called force majeure clauses, which say for particular unexpected events, particular things can happen and particular processes are then in place. There are also what is called morality clauses, something that causes the name of Chelsea to be seen in a poor light. What 3 have not done is terminated the deal. They have said they have suspended the deal at present.
Yes.
There has to be a question around the same approach for Nike, for example, and for other of their main sponsors. What we are talking about is perhaps a 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 month possible suspension of the revenues until the situation is resolved either way, and the license is renewed or is going in different ways, or a sale happens. I read it was reports that three actually were requesting that their logo would be removed from the Chelsea shirt. There obviously now is an issue around whether three may want to enforce the removal of their logo from the Chelsea shirt whilst the suspension continues. And that is something, that I haven't really seen before. The only time I've seen this happen is when, for example, a sponsor goes into administration or goes bankrupt halfway through the season, and then they tape up or provide a new sponsor or something over the top of it.
Yeah, something similar happened to Lazio a few years ago in Italy when Lazio were in danger. I agree with you, it's something absolutely new at this level with Chelsea. So let's see what happens with Premier League approval, but this will be another key point for Chelsea. Is about the public image they have, of course. So to see Chelsea shirts without a sponsor would be something absolutely new. So let's see what happens on this point. But some Chelsea fans are asking us to say it's a genuine possibility to see Chelsea that could go bust. You think it's a serious possibility in this kind of situation, or it's too negative to think about it?
Look, if someone had said to me 2 years ago or 1 year ago that Chelsea would be under such restrictions, I would have said it's very difficult. So everything changes always, especially more than I in football. There is nothing stranger than fiction, really, and the same is true here. I think as a result, nothing can be off the table. I think usually the issue for administration is the club not being able to pay its debts as they fall due. That is usually down to cash flow. If, for example, Chelsea were to say to the government on the basis of their license, look, we will run out of cash to be able to pay everybody in 3 months' time. And as a result, if you don't want us to go into administration because we do not think a sale is going to happen in time, we ask you to be able to allow us to sell 2 of our players, for example. And that will bring in enough cash to last us, we believe, until a sale can happen at whatever time that might be. Now, whether that will be the case and whether the government would allow that is a very different question. We're speaking about lots of difficult scenarios that have never occurred in my experience.
I'm sure that this Chelsea story and your answers will be really helpful to understand for Chelsea fans what's next, and we will see, of course, because it's a dangerous situation for Chelsea, but even for other clubs, because we know that it's not only Roman Abramovich to own football clubs around Europe, around top leagues. What I wanted to ask you, do you think other clubs and of course their owners should potentially be worried about the current situation, and will be maybe they able to prevent this kind of sanctions of problems? So how do you see the general situation apart of Chelsea that we discussed?
Well, I thought that the biggest controversy in recent times, or the biggest stories in recent times, was COVID. And then COVID became, in the UK, Project Big Picture, and that was the biggest one. And then Project Big Picture falls away, and then Super League comes in. The Ukraine war begins, and then this matter occurs. As wealthier people get into football and become owners of sports institutions, they are more likely than ever to have links to particular countries, to particular governments, because those are the only types of entities that can afford the significant amounts needed to be able to buy very large sporting institutions. So this is when the politics of a country, of Europe, of different parts of the world intertwine with the politics of sport. And as more of these larger institutions become more ingrained in sport, these types of issues, I feel, are going to only happen more regularly.
It's going to be interesting to see what's next. Daniel, before saying thank you, a quick question I wanted to ask you about your work, your approach to this moment. You said we had COVID, we had Super League, we have the war now in Ukraine. So this kind of stuff are changing the world and the world of football too. how difficult is on your side as a football lawyer for many agents and people involved in football industry to prepare contracts now? Because when you move to top clubs, maybe I can understand about the excitement, and so maybe some people are not careful, but many people are careful about contracts, about predicting even difficult and crazy situations. How difficult it is now to manage with this kind of stories in football to protect your clients?
Incredibly difficult is the answer. Because if I was a time traveler, it would be straightforward. I could look into the future and remember all of the things that may happen and then put them in the contract to try and look for every eventuality. My main role is to try and minimize risk. That's how I see a lot of my job. How to educate my clients, if it's players or agents or high net worth individuals or club owners, to be able to say, if this particular situation occurs, this is your risk. So usually, in my experience, a lot of the time, you know as better than I with your relationships with agents and players especially, it is always to do with leverage. It is always to know who has the upper hand in a negotiation, and ultimately to be able to then use your leverage positively to extract the maximum value and ensure the minimum risk. I always worry about a contract being entered into, because there are always unforeseen circumstances that cannot be future proofed.
Yes, and thank you really, Daniel, for sharing your experience. It was a super pleasure, as always, to have you here to discuss Chelsea and all the details of this story. Thank you, Daniel.
Pleasure. Look forward to chatting next time.
Thank you to Daniel, and thank you for listening and watching Debatable on 11 Football. As always, remember to let us know your thoughts on anything we've been discussing today. Leave a comment on YouTube or review wherever you're listening to your podcast. We wait for you. Subscribe to the channel and see you soon on Debatable.